Hey there. So we've had a pretty wild whirlwind week for Warcry news lately, and you know we could see the whole game change pretty drastically in the next 2 weeks. So I figured, why not just kind of one go through the last week in news, but then also do some wish listing, plant my flag in the ground of this is what I hope to see, and then in a week and a half's time we'll get to find out. For those who don't know, we've been getting kind of a steady drip feed of news about the Tome of Champions coming in. First, there was the news that we were getting Underworlds, then we found out we'd get points updates. Now we're getting sort of campaign news coming in. We also have a release date now. And this is kind of going to signal the arrival of Warcry 1.2, I'd say. Starting with the original starter box, then the Grand Alliance books being Warcry 1.1, and now this being sort of the first sort of sweeping set of points updates. I would say we're still likely to get a new edition in about 6 months, sometime this summer. But if you're one of the few holdouts who doesn't think we will, or if you're one of the people who just doesn't want one, this gives you a little bit of hope, because it does seem a little odd to give all these points updates if you're then going to kind of change the game completely in 6 months anyway. My only thing there would be, I think it just signals a change of approach to how they want to manage Warcry. They recently moved it from the boxed games section to a subsection of AOS, which they also did with Kill Team. The fact that that is true, paired with them pushing to get Warcry into Adepticon, them putting a tournament pack in this new Tome of Champions, then of course this first sort of set of points updates, it makes me think that they want to push Warcry as sort of an event game for people who don't want to commit to the entire size of an AOS army. And I think that's really great. Yeah, just a great development in general, and sort of a reason why they would be willing to make a bunch of points updates to put that much effort into this book, even if they're going to do a new edition, and for this sort of to be their first kind of step towards what they'll have in the new edition that will theoretically probably be a little bit more sort of event oriented. Hopefully, it doesn't lose the kind of Warcry narrative flavor, and the news that we just dropped this morning about branching quests, that I didn't have time to sort of get into the slides for this video, but I do think that that points to the fact that they know that Warcry, a lot of people are treating it like a narrative game, like kind of D&D with Games Workshop miniatures almost. I think they know that that's happening. I don't think we'll lose that with the new edition. We'll just probably gain a slightly more competitive side as well. So I want to kind of do some wish listing. I almost never do any wish listing on this show, just because, or on this channel, just because I think mostly it's pretty, I don't know, it's not very productive. It just makes you feel frustrated. But I just want to be able to say, sort of before the Tome of Champions, this is what I hoped for. And then afterwards, I can kind of compare what we got to what I hoped for. I think they have a few different approaches they could take. One, they could just hit the tournament relevant items, kind of diminish pet meta, and then let us go from there with kind of our established meta game with just 4 fewer S tier factions. They could also soften some of the overall mistakes in the original pointing algorithm. This is kind of the method I think they'll take. I'll go more into what those mistakes are soon. And then the third would be to treat it like a real game, like the way they point 40k AOS, or the way kind of Magic does their balancing. And I'll get into that as well. Then there's also, of course, there's the darkest timeline where they just listen to the Facebook bad takes from people who I think like the game but don't totally understand the game that well, and maybe have some incorrect opinions about what's actually happening underneath the hood. But let's talk about some basic changes, some issues with the original pointing algorithm, right? There's kind of the much celebrated toughness tax. Recent releases have been a little bit better for this, but still kind of rough. So, for example, toughness 5 models are a little bit better in recent releases, but for example, the toughness 6 stuff, like some of the Stormcast toughness 6 stuff, has just been a total joke. I do wonder if this is intentional, if they want Warcry to be kind of a more offensive game, and so they might give some help to some tough fighters, but in overall, I don't think they want the competitive strategy or to become really defensive, because then that sort of trickles down to the casual side of the game and makes kind of games move more slowly. Um, Another issue is move 3 units being kind of unplayable. Move 3 models just have to bring incredible utility or have access to a movement buff, like say, what Soulblight can with allying and Flesh Eater Courts, stuff like that. This is another one that's better in new releases, starting from the Lumineth release onwards. I think they've kind of shown they understand how to point move 3, and they just need to bring that kind of backwards in time to the GA books. Now, the same is true with leader tax. The GA books shipped with leader units having kind of a significant leader tax, and their recent releases have kind of reduced that pretty heavily, in fact. I still think there should be some leader tax, but it should be small. And I think that's what their recent releases have mostly done, and I think that there's a very, very good chance that they end up adding that to this edition. Finally, currently, chaff breaks the game a little bit. I talk about pet meta every once in a while, but that's just the idea that there are these 4 chaff units that are head and shoulders above every other unit in the game. But even without them, spamming chaff in general is too easy and just too often the correct choice. Because there's 2 things happening in the game that make chaff really powerful. One is just the cost of an activation in general. If you could just buy an activation that didn't even do anything, it just said, okay, if you could just buy a free weight, essentially, you would often do that in your lists. You would spend maybe 10, 20 points on, maybe 10 points for 1, 20 points for 2. You would do that. You wouldn't buy a ton of weights, but you would buy a couple of them. And so that sort of value of just having an activation isn't really included in the points cost of most of these really cheap units, and so it kind of breaks the game when you have a ton of them. The other thing, though, that compounds that, and I think makes this an issue in the game, at least at the competitive level, or at the kind of casual but one person has a more tuned warband than the other type of level, is that chaff models, they aren't just valuable for what they do mechanically in game as far as giving you extra activations, but they also tend to be point for point the most efficient stat units in the game. And I think that's where we really run into a problem, is when the point for point efficiency of your models are also, like, the most efficient models are also the models that the game mechanics are telling you are the most powerful models. They kind of get this double boost, and I think that they just need to ease up on the point for point efficiency of cheap models, make most of the cheap models just a little bit more expensive, so that they're only getting that one advantage instead of 2 advantages. Because the side effect right now is that mid-size units, anything between 100 points and 180 points, all of them are terrible. Almost every model between 100 and 180 points is bad. And I think the sort of incredible efficiency of all of the below 70 point units is the reason for that. So to give some really quick examples, so the pets, Potgrots, Aetherwings, Giant Spiders, all of them need at least 10 points. Some of them I would do more. For example, Spiders, I would add at least 20 points. But generally, most fighters below 70 points are just a little bit too efficient. You also see a lot of slow and tough fighters like Hearthguard Berserkers or Chaos Warrior with Shield that are just kind of, they get this double whammy where they have move 3, but then also if you made a quadrant, right, of fast versus slow, tough versus sort of damaging, you see a lot of warbands in the slow and tough range, or like slow and defensive oriented range, and it's just the worst place to be in Warcry right now, because fast is valued over slow in terms of the points algorithms, and then you pay a toughness tax as well. So a lot of a lot of fighters could use some help there. Then you also just have leader tax stuff. For an example of that, the Iron Golem's Dominar at 145 points would not be a very special unit. It's currently 175, to just give you an example of how intense that leader tax is there. Another option, when I first when I first put these slides together, I kind of really wanted them to do this. Now I'm less sure, so I'm going to just explain it, and so you'll see what I mean, and you can make your own decision. In AOS, factions pay less for their strengths, right? So Nurgle anvils, so defensive units, cost less than Slaanesh ones do, and they should. Slaanesh hammers, actually at the moment they don't cost less than Nurgle hammers, but they should, right? They're supposed to, because that's what Slaanesh is good at. So for example, Daughters of Cain, a hammer would cost less than a Nurgle one, because they're a damagey faction. In MTG you see this too, right? Different colors pay different costs for certain effects. The meme right now is just that green and blue get whatever they want for whatever cost they want it at. But in general, right, you'll see that, there are certain things where for 2 mana white can do something, and for 2 mana maybe, or blue can also do that thing, but probably only for 3 mana, right? You see that a lot in that game. You could argue that Warcry should do the same. I think that technology-wise, every one of these sort of big, sort of very wide list-building games, all of the ones that want to be taken seriously as something you'd have events for, all of them do this. The issue is that doing it requires a ton of playtesting, and I'm not sure that Games Workshop has the willpower right now to actually put the resources forward to do that for this game. But the benefit to it is that the correct quote-unquote way to list build starts to vary from faction to faction if you do that. Whereas right now, even if you kind of pointed everything correctly, if you have the same pointing algorithm for every faction, you run into this issue where the correct way to build your list is still pretty similar based on every faction. It's just that each faction has different tools. You combine them a little differently, but you combine them all on the same paradigm. If you kind of playtest enough and figure out sort of different ways to point different factions differently that still end up balanced, you end up creating the situation where players have sort of a deep list building experience that changes based on what faction they're playing. And I think that that's really valuable, and that adds a ton of replayability to your game. And that's why all these bigger games all do it. So an example of that, right? You could have sort of an overall rating for, I do this for my Math Hammer video. You can check that out. It's sort of deep in my archives there. And then you could assign roles, or sort of things that each unit is doing. And then you just allow your allowable rating. Let's say your rating is 20, right, of what you want everything to be. You could just have an allowable rating that shifts based on roles. So you could have one faction say, one type of unit, we allow it to be rating 21, and another type of unit, it's 19. And then for another one, it flips. And so you have different factions doing different things at a different kind of skill level, right? So an example would be Maw Tribes versus Iron Golems. Ogres, they're supposed to just be these strong, monstrous melee factions, right? So you could keep Club Gluttons at 205. They're just really well pointed in general, I think. But then you'd need to drop the Iron Gut to 200 flat. It actually does less damage than a Glutton, which makes no sense, but is much harder to kill, right? So if it were just 200 flat instead of 235, it'd be much more sort of usable. But then you'd also want to raise Noblars up to like 55, add 10 points each to these kind of fast mid-size units they have, like Yetis, Gorgers, and Frost Sabers. A 180 point Frost Saber is still pretty good, by the way, because they're so quick. But it would make it way less clear that that's strictly what you should be doing, whereas right now, doing regular ogres doesn't make a ton of sense. And so you would kind of vary how they point things based on what the faction is supposed to be good at. And then, sort of conversely, iron golems have these powerful mid-sized soldiers, or that's what they're supposed to be. Now, the ogre breacher, right, is similar stat-wise to a lot of ogres. It just it's at 235 right now. It's overpointed. It's not very good. You could say, though, that you keep that expensive. Maybe you still drop it a little because it's wildly overpointed now, but maybe you just keep it expensive at 225. And then you keep legionaries kind of not that efficient either because iron golems aren't about their chaff. And then you just drop their mid-size units really far, right? You drop the prefect and dominar to 105 and 145 instead of what's now 125 and 175. Maybe you drop the armator to 85 points, right? You drop all of their mid-size units. Maybe not the drill master by too much because it's already pretty solid, but even from 125 to 120, that wouldn't do anything wrong, and it would, help give iron golems this identity as this sort of middle semi-elite kind of disciplined, we are war being there, or we make war being their kind of their rallying cry of these sort of regular blacksmiths who are just very good at what they do. So that's kind of how you would do it. Again, to do that for every faction in the game would require a ton of playtesting, and I'm not sure that they're ready for that, so I'm not sure I want them to go for this approach. Now, the disaster scenario is if they've been listening to the folks on... Listen, I love the Facebook chat, but you get a lot of bad takes on there. The problem is people play out-of-the-box Warcry warbands against optimized AOS lists. They don't really play a lot of optimized Warcry warbands because that requires, instead of getting the Warcry box, which is what a lot of people bought and is a terrible deal, getting the AOS box, which you get 2 Warcry boxes, but you don't get the cards, which, some people love the cards, I get it, but you don't need them to play, right, if you have your book anyway. And it gives you just way more options to optimize. Most of the bespoke warbands can actually compete with AOS lists if you have that double box. And it's, a much better deal per model as well. What worries me is if Games Workshop has been listening to some of the worst takes about what's going on, you could see them do just like really intense across the board points drops to all of the bespoke factions, and a few of them are poised to really truly break the game if they get some points buffs. Tarantulos is already the strongest faction in the game. They desperately need some points hikes. Corvus Cabal, Cypher Lords, and Splintered Fang are all in a really good spot. Maybe Cypher Lords is a little bit behind the other two, but all of them are poised to kind of break the game with some points buffs. Cypher Lords has that teleport that right now isn't that problematic because most of the Cypher Lords fighters die so quickly. But if all of a sudden you have 2 more fighters on the board, then your opponent isn't really able to chew through your fighters, and now that teleport is actually really terrifying. Some of the units that you can teleport with Cypher Lords, the ability lets you teleport them into combat. So you have an opponent, as soon as they activate with a valuable unit, you just go up to it, you teleport something straight into it, they can't react with that unit, now you just blow up that unit with the thing you've teleported into combat that now gets to double attack. The Cypher Lords combo is ridiculously strong, and the only thing that holds it back is the fact that Cypher Lords are just pointed right now to be very fragile. If they were a lot cheaper, if Games Workshop is not listening, or is mostly listening to some of the people who don't really understand the game that well, they could really accidentally break some of these factions. Untamed Beasts and the Unmade would also be really scary with buffs, but I don't think they would break the game. They would just become very competitive. So this would be very much a worry. I think another thing that kind of causes this is a lot of players kind of worry in general about... so this was a big thing before people realized that chaff was the strongest thing in Warcry. You heard a lot of people complaining about elites, that elites are too hard to take down. And a lot of AOS warbands have elites, whereas some of the original ones don't. The main reason it feels hard to take elites down is, one, people didn't realize you could swarm elites with chaff, and they're actually really easy to take down if you do that. But the other thing is, people thought like 2 mid-size units should be able to fight an elite unit, and all the mid-size units are just pointed terribly. So some of the, if you are going to fix the OG warbands, I think you need to drop the points on all of their kind of 120 point models. All of these warbands have like a 120 point, 140 point model that's just awful, and then they'll have like 3 of them in the box, and that's why it's bad out of the box, and that's why they're good once you get 2 and you can just cut them. But if they want to be helping these out of the box warbands without breaking the game, that's what they need to focus on, is dropping the points on those kind of 120 to 140, 150 point models that are in these boxes. So let's do the real wish listing now. I just wanted to put out my top 15 wishes for the game as far as doing this. I didn't double up on any factions here. I just wanted to give kind of a wide sense of what I would change so that you can either argue, I love that, or kind of extrapolate to maybe what I would change for something that isn't on this list. My number 1, if they don't change anything else except for 4 points changes, that's it in the whole thing, would just be the pets. Spiders, I think, need to almost double. At 55 points, they'd still be one of the best things to do in the game. They wouldn't be game breaking at 55 points, but they'd be sort of the competitive pillar of the format. So at 60 points, I think, is where they should lie. Potgrot, I think, really only has to go up 10 points. I think it's a problem in the game right now, but it wouldn't have to change much to not be a problem. Aetherwings, I think 15 points on Aetherwings, 15 points on Giant Rats. Those were kind of the 2 best in the game by a lot before the other 2 pets came in to kind of challenge them. I think all 4 of those pets, currently they break the game. If you don't have a pet, you're not a competitive warband. And so those are sort of my number 1 through 4. The others, though, I think I wanted to give kind of a general sense here of what you can change in the game. So a couple move 3 units, right? Hearthguard Berserkers, right now they're 115 and 110. I think at 95 and 90, that would all of a sudden make you be much more interested in playing them in Fire Slayers, or just playing Fire Slayers at all. Mortek Guard really don't need to go down by a lot. If they were kind of 75 and 90, right, I think that would be fine. I really hesitate to bring anything below 75 with points drops, because then it becomes pretty spammable. But at 75 and 90, it would just open up a lot of list building opportunities for Ossiarch Bone Reapers, and it wouldn't really be busted because, again, they're move 3. To show you a few units currently paying a big toughness tax, Grimghast Reapers, such a cool model, such a cool sort of stat line, even, being this kind of very tough 2-inch reach, sort of very difficult to chew through kind of unit, right, because the 2-inch reach makes something more durable. And at 135 points, though, it's just not very playable. But at 100, it would be competitive. It would be very interesting. It would be very powerful. And Nighthaunt kind of needs the help. Sequitors, you can kind of see they've done a little bit of this with the Thunderstrike release, but Sequitors, the ones with shields, could easily be 145 or 150, and it wouldn't really change much at all. The ones with the big Grand Hammer, those you couldn't drop that much, but you could still drop them 10 points, and it would just be still totally safe, right? Any of the non-Aetherwing Stormcast, there's really just, you wouldn't really be able to break the game with them, with their stats as is. Another one is Chaos Warriors, which are just way too expensive right now. I think both the shield and the 2-weapon versions should both be 130, and that would kind of take care of the toughness tax on those. To give you a sense of kind of the tax that mid-size units play, it's not that mid-size units, well, the main issue with them is that they have the same toughness as elite units, but they don't have the extra stuff that elite units have, like extra attacks, things like that, that are pointed correctly. So it's a little bit of a toughness tax thing, but also just the mechanics of the game. Um, Activations make you want chaff models. Ability dice make you want elite models where you get more value out of the dice on a big model than you do on a small model. And so the mechanics of the game make you want to stretch to the edges. And so all the mid-size units are bad. So things like the Iron Golem's Prefect, things like the Simbaresh out of Slaanesh Mortals, those kind of things could all just drop 10 to 15 points depending on the model. There's very few of these 120, 130 point models that would break the game if you dropped them 10 points. Almost none of them really. So I would honestly drop 10 points to most of the 120, 130, 140 point models in the game. Um, Finally, kind of other chaff that would take over if you nerf spiders and birds and things like that. Noblars, skeletons, netters, these are some examples. You could go marauders. Almost all of these could use a 5 to 10 point uh, boost depending on what they are. Noblars I gave 10 points to because they're just a little bit stronger and they kind of are weird in their faction. Their faction's not supposed to be heavy chaff, but they have these Noblars that are really good. But you don't have to bring them up very much, right? Because the whole thing is that you're spamming them, and so um, drop increasing by 5 points on these skeletons, that is a 10% increase. That's the same as going 10 on a 100 point model. So um, it would actually decrease how many you have, probably by about 2, which all of a sudden gives the less elite warbands just a better chance at chewing through them. Because remember, it's not that the difference is you have 6 now instead of 8. It's the difference that after your opponent has killed 4 of them, you have 2 now instead of 4, right? So I do think even just a small change would really, really help as far as chaff there. And it wouldn't change the overall structure of Warcry, right? You'd still want to have lots of activations in your warbands, right? Because I'm not looking to kind of completely upend what our game is. Another thing, though, the contorted epitome, if we did make all these changes, would have to go up about 10 points, just because this would one of the things that stops the epitome from being completely oppressive in meta play is that you can kind of just outswarm it, and you can put so many things on the board that Slaanesh isn't able to kill them all with their admittedly very powerful demonettes that are very good at killing. Um, if you sort of do make mid-size units more of a part of the game, if you kind of reduce the incentives to chaff up just by a little bit, you really help the contorted epitome out, and it's already very, very strong. So I do think just adding 10 points to it, the current Slaanesh list with the epitome is exactly 1,000 points. So adding 10 points to the epitome either forces them to drop it or drop something else for something slightly cheaper. So it forces them to change their list a little bit. The thing that you'll notice here is that there's almost no sort of really big 200 plus point models in the game, other than the epitome, which is a very special case. There's almost none of them that are really pointed embarrassingly. A few of them are just like toughness 6 models that need to come down. But for the most part, most expensive models in the game are actually pointed pretty well. And I wouldn't want them to make too many changes as far as that goes. I think the way that ability dice work with elite units, I think, is just a really solid point of the game right now. And you just need to change kind of the lower levels to fix that balance, I think. Okay, so there's just a few kind of wishes and kind of analysis of what could be in the tome. I'm really excited to find out what's in there. I'm also excited to kind of look up more of the branching quests. I've only done one campaign. Otherwise, I've almost all done matched play. But, part of it was that was back when campaigns were on rails. And, with Red Harvest, they started doing this. And now with this tome, there's sort of more that you can do as far as making your campaign like a D&D game. So that's going to be pretty exciting. Although, at least through Adepticon, I'll probably be focusing on how this tome kind of shakes up the Warcry kind of competitive scene a little bit. And I'm excited for that. There's going to be a lot to go through, both kind of winners and losers, which of the new Underworld bands are the strongest, kind of theory crafting what the top lists look like now. So there's going to be a ton to go through as far as reaction to this update, and that's really exciting. So, probably going to go dark until we actually know the exact, the exactly what's in there. That could either happen when Man Who reads book this weekend, or this might be too small a game for Man Who Reads Book to take notice, in which case, I'll know on the 19th, and that's when you'll start seeing me again. So until then, may all your rolls be crits.